Just look at this number, 15. Back in the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee decided to track the daily lives of the Kong Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert literally down to the minute. He wanted to know exactly how much time were they spending just surviving. The answer? Right around 15 hours a week. That is the entire amount of time they spent hunting, gathering, cooking, and doing the basic chores needed to stay alive. No bosses, no rent. They didn't even have weekends, because practically every single day was a weekend. When you explicitly compare our modern lives to theirs, it's honestly pretty shocking. Today, modern humans spend about 90,000 hours of their lives working. That's a massive, soul-crushing career burden that eats up a whole third of your waking existence. But ancient humans? They worked maybe 2.5 hours a day. To put that into perspective, most of us hit that amount of work before we've even had our second cup of coffee. So it really leaves you wondering, if they only spent a couple of hours a day surviving, what on earth did they do with all that extra free time? Well, having that kind of abundant free time built a completely different rhythm to daily life. Here's how an ancient day basically flowed, and as you'll see, it is incredibly slow and relaxed. They'd wake up at dawn just to sit around and talk. Mid-morning was designated for a brief bit of foraging or hunting. Midday, that was totally dedicated to resting and sharing whatever food they found. And then the evening was all about gathering around the fire for storytelling. There was absolutely no clock dictating the pace, just the natural rhythm of the sun and the people around them. Let's zoom in on that first phase of the day. Anthropologist Polly Wesner noted something amazing. The very first hour is spent entirely on talking. But we're not just talking about trivial gossip here. This morning chat was essentially the operating system of the entire camp. They'd talk about who took a little more than their fair share yesterday, who told a really good joke, or maybe who had been quiet and might be feeling sick. It literally functioned as their ancient legal framework. Just by whispering and chatting, they maintained perfect social order without ever needing a courtroom. And that brings us to this absolutely fascinating social rule. When Richard Lee was living with the Kong, he wanted to do something nice, right? So he bought them this massive, fat Christmas ox as a gift. But instead of being super grateful, they relentlessly mocked him for weeks. They kept telling him the ox was skinny and totally worthless. He was completely baffled until an elder finally pulled him aside and explained, the bigger the kill, the harder they mock. See, insulting the meat is this brilliant tool they use to keep egos in check. If you bring home a massive hunt or huge gift, they immediately cut you down to size just to enforce strict equality. And this brilliantly illustrates a major misconception we have about the past. We are constantly fed this myth of the alpha male hunter, right? But the reality was completely different. In hunter-gatherer societies, like the Hadza for example, women actually provide more than half of the camp's calories. Hunting is highly dramatic, sure, but it's also deeply unreliable. A hunter might trek 20 miles and come back totally empty-handed. Meanwhile, the women are out there gathering every single day, returning with a steady, guaranteed source of food. So the men might feast you occasionally, but it's the women who feed you daily. But wait, it gets even more surprising when you look at who exactly is doing the bulk of that gathering. It's the grandmothers. There's actually an anthropological theory called the grandmother hypothesis, which argues that human females living decades past menopause is literally the secret to our species' success. Women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s were actually the most productive gatherers in the whole camp. A lot of them would walk 5 to 10 miles a day well into their 70s just to bring back food for their grandkids. They ensured the whole community thrived. So, you might be thinking, where were all the kids while the adults were working? Well, obviously, there was no formal school. Instead, kids basically spent their days in mixed-age playgroups. The older kids taught the younger ones. They'd just naturally copy the working adults around them. By the time a boy was 8, he might be out hunting a small bird. And by age 10, kids were already contributing meaningfully to their families. They learned absolutely everything they needed just by existing in the community, playing, and being guided by their siblings. All right, fast forward to midday. The first food starts coming back into camp, and this brings us to a strictly non-negotiable law, the rule of absolute sharing. If a hunter kills an animal, he doesn't actually own that meat. It gets distributed immediately, and the hunter himself often gets the worst cut. Anthropologists actually believe that this complex social arithmetic of generosity, tracking who gave what to whom and who stepped up when times were tough, is literally what drove the evolution of the human brain. Generosity wasn't just them being nice, it was their collective savings account. Once that midday meal is over, the blazing afternoon sun literally forces the whole camp to slow down. This chunk of time was meant for the body and for social bonding. They'd take naps in the shade, they'd casually repair their tools or weave baskets. They even spent hours picking lice out of each other's hair, which, okay, sounds a bit gross to us today, but it was really just a physical way to stay close and bond with the people they loved. They dedicated literal hours every single day to resting and reinforcing their relationships. Now, they were still human, of course, so affairs, jealousy, and really deep grudges absolutely still happened. But the way they handled conflict resolution was entirely different. Think about modern societies. We use prisons, police, lawsuits. Ancient humans, they used a brilliantly simple method called voting with your feet. Because practically everything they owned fit into a single bag, if someone just couldn't stand a campmate anymore, they'd simply pack up and leave for a few weeks to cool off. They physically walked away until the anger naturally passed. Then, as the sun sets, we see a dramatic shift in behavior. According to an analysis of hundreds of hours of recorded camp conversations, daytime talk was mostly practical, or just people complaining. But at night, around the glow of the fire, 81% of their conversations completely shifted over to storytelling. They'd tell intricate myths about how the world began, share tales of their ancestors, and just tell jokes. The safety and warmth of that firelight allowed them to think way beyond basic immediate survival. It basically marked the birth of human culture. Now, what's really interesting about all this is the physical proof of their free time. We've got this tendency to think of ancient survival as this desperate, grueling struggle. But just look at the art they left behind. 30,000 years ago, humans were painting absolute masterpieces in Chauvet Cave. 100,000 years ago, they were walking miles just to collect and painstakingly drill tiny shells for jewelry in Blombos Cave. 40,000 years ago, someone carved a perfectly pitched flute out of a vulture bone. There is no way they did this for survival. They simply had the abundant free time to create sophisticated art and music purely for the beauty of it. Honestly, even the way they slept was relaxed. Before artificial light messed everything up, humans naturally experienced a two-phase sleep cycle. They'd have a first sleep for about 4 hours, then they would wake up in the pitch darkness for an hour or two. They used that time for quiet reflection, talking, or intimacy, and then they'd drift back off for a second sleep. What we absolutely stress out about today, labeling it as 2 a.m. insomnia, was actually just a completely normal, biologically designated time for ancient humans to be awake and peaceful. So, the big question, what happened to this incredibly balanced, peaceful 15-hour work week? Well, about 10,000 years ago, we walked right into the agricultural trap. Humans in the Fertile Crescent started planting seeds and domesticating animals. And sure, farming meant we could suddenly feed way more people, which led to exploding populations. But it also meant we were suddenly locked in. We literally couldn't go back to hunting and gathering because there were just too many mouths to feed. We traded a life of abundant free time for an endless, grueling cycle of manual labor. And if you want proof, we can see exactly what that trap did to our bodies. The skeletal evidence is undeniable. When you look at hunter-gatherer skeletons, they were taller, they had strong teeth, and they showed very little joint damage. But those early farmer skeletons, it's a completely different story. They were shorter, their teeth were riddled with cavities from all those grain-heavy diets, and they suffered from severe spinal arthritis because of the repetitive, back-breaking labor. Farming objectively brought vastly more physical pain, much worse nutrition, and shorter lifespans compared to foraging. Now, to be completely clear here, nobody is suggesting we completely abandon the modern world and go live in caves, because we did make some incredibly real, valuable traits. We got massive wins: vaccines, antibiotics, refrigeration, indoor plumbing, and much longer lives where far, far fewer children pass away. But we really need to look at the losses, too. We sacrificed that original affluent lifestyle. We literally invented bosses, bills, strict schedules, and jobs where time is entirely owned by somebody else. Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought. We basically traded the vast, unstructured freedom of the 15-hour workweek for the physical security of modern civilization. But here's the catch. We inherited the exact same bodies and nervous systems as those ancient humans. We still have the exact same biological need for sunshine, sleep, human touch, and time spent doing genuinely nothing. Yet we now work 90,000 hours over a lifetime just to survive. So as you look at your own daily schedule tomorrow morning, ask yourself, was the trade truly worth it?